started. So we're recording. Cool. Well, welcome, Gilbert. Appreciate you coming on here to let us know a little bit about La Raza. We'll get started in just a little bit. Thank you for all the students that are joining us today. I always like to let everybody know why we're doing this. This is kind of a outgrowth, a result of the pandemic we've been in and kind of the isolation, at least I've been feeling as an instructor here at South Texas College. Not only am I not able to interact with students, but I'm not able to, on a regular basis, interact with my colleagues. And one of the things I did notice with that absence of interacting with my colleagues is there were always times when I would run into a colleague and learn a little bit about what they were into academically. And a whole semester of that, I realized that was gone. And then trying to teach online, the absence of being able to interact with students, I started reaching out to colleagues and asking them to kind of present things that I knew that they were quite aware of that I could learn further about. So this is something I saw Mr. Reyes present, gosh, how long have I been here? About 14 years ago, when we did the Knox conference here.
You're old, Sean.
At STC, yes. Back then, I don't think I had as much gray hair, and my hair was much shorter, and I had no facial hair. But I did see you present this, and I was incredibly impressed with this presentation. Not only for what the content was conveying, but from what I recall, it was a while back, you made a pretty concerted effort of how the subject matter of tonight's presentation can relate to many of our students here at South Texas College. So I'm very excited to once again get immersed with this again, and for students who might have never heard of what you're about to present, or if they have heard of it, to get into it a little bit deeper. I think this is going to be a pretty exciting event. So with that said, let's go forward and see where we go from here. I'll let you, yeah.
All right, thanks, Sean. Listen, first of all, I want to thank you for putting this together. I know that this is a very difficult time in all of our lives because of the pandemic, so this is an exciting and very good initiative on your part, so I want to thank you personally. And most importantly, I want to thank all of the students who've tuned in tonight. I want to say welcome, hello, ¿qué onda? ¿Cómo están? The topic that I want to talk about tonight is La Raza Cósmica. This is something that a lot of people know more about than they may think they do, because if you're a person of Latino persuasion at all, you are very, very familiar with a lot of this stuff. What I want to do tonight is I want to kind of introduce the concept to people, and then show them how this relates to themselves in this particular moment in history, right? And so what I want to talk about first is the title that you see here. I want to apologize to all of the students first. I have a series of slides to show you folks, but I didn't put them in any order, so I may have to flip back and forth. I have some notes right here that tell me what to put with what, so I'm going to have to ask for your indulgence here right at the beginning. I apologize if it's a little confusing. But give me some time when I move from slide to slide, and we'll get through this. What you see here is the front cover of a pamphlet that was written in 1925 by a Mexican minister of education by the name of Jose Vasconcelos, right? Vasconcelos, I want to state this right off the top, even though he has the term raza in the title, the cosmic race, this is not a book about race, okay? Just want to be very clear about that. We know in our more enlightened time of the 21st century that race is largely an illusion, right? Racism is real, but there is no way that our skin color affects the way we think, live, dream. That is just not the way our species works. Racism, again, is very real, based upon skin color, but race itself is more of an illusion than anything else. But that being said, Vasconcelos wasn't really talking about race when he used the term raza. He wrote this in 1925. And at that time, raza, race, was pretty much interchangeable with the term culture. So what he's talking about instead of cosmic race is a cosmic culture, right? Now, this guy Vasconcelos is not a great thinker, all right? Let's get that off the charts right now, right? This guy is not a genius. He is not one of these people who deserves to be remembered for the immense intelligence that he showed, right? To me, he's more like a broken clock, which is right twice a day, right? Vasconcelos wrote a pamphlet called Raza Cósmica, which he published in 1925, in part as a means of explaining what he hoped to accomplish as Minister of Education for the country of Mexico. He had just been appointed to that position by a new political party that had taken control in the nation of Mexico in the name of the largest group of people living there, the group of people we know as mestizos. Now, again, if you're a Latin American, you know this term mestizo. You have heard it your entire life, right? And by the time Vasconcelos came to power as Minister of Education in 1925, under the auspices of a new political party called the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the PRI, right? He was given the task of reorganizing the Mexican education system so that mestizos could see how they fit into the greater flow of history, right? That was his goal here. That's what he was trying to accomplish when he wrote this particular little cosmic race pamphlet. Now, this thing isn't long. It's only like 40 pages, if that, maybe like 37 or something. And you can essentially split it into two different parts. One part, which is like the part you read and you say, man, put down the pipe, all right? What are you smoking, right? Don't smoke and write. The other part is sublime, right? And the real problem in reading Raza Cósmica is that he mixes the two together. Sometimes one line of insanity is followed by another line of absolute gorgeousness, sublimity, right? And it's very difficult sometimes to kind of figure out what this guy's trying to get at because you start thinking about the crazy stuff and you forget about the good stuff. For me, get rid of all of the crazy stuff, and what you're left with is absolutely beautiful, right? First, the crazy stuff. Let me see if I can find you Vasconcelos here. I know that I put a picture of him somewhere.
I think he's towards the end.
I'm sorry?
Towards the end, if you just scroll all the way down.
Uh-huh. Again, I apologize. Have patience with me, folks. I did not put these in any kind of an order. Okay, there you go. There's Jose Vasconcelos, right? Now, Vasconcelos wrote things that were absolutely insane, like all human beings descend from a race of super people who lived on the continent of Atlantis that was destroyed when the ocean levels rose. Woo! Right? There are a whole bunch of different religions in the world, and all of them deserve respect, but the right one is Catholicism. Again, I don't know what you think of that, but not everybody in the world is Catholic, right? There are all different types of shades of human beings, but the white ones are the prettiest ones. Now, that's the lunacy part, and it's all over Raza Cósmica, right? But if you excise that, if you cut it out, then what you're left with is stuff that is absolutely stunning, right? What Vasconcelos says in the other part is that if you take a look at the history of humanity up until this point, right, there are people who have been living in frontier regions everywhere, all over the planet. However, there is something unique about Mexico because during its time period as part of the Spanish Empire, Mexico became the frontier, the frontera of the world. It became the beating heart of the first global empire in human history that was created by the Spaniards in the 1500s, right? This would be the very first empire upon which people could say the sun never set, right? During the 15 and 1600s, Spain would conquer every single inch of South America that any European could get a hold of. They had all of North America that any European could get a hold of until the British came successfully in the early 1600s. Spain had a foothold on the northern rim of Africa for reasons you'll see later, right? They had a foothold in the Far East, right? And what this means, obviously, Spain being in Europe, is that Spain had contact with 5 of the 6 continents that people can live on. The only one they didn't go to was Australia because they didn't know it existed. Nobody didn't until the middle of the 1600s, right? So what we're talking about is a global empire that Spain built. And the center of it was Mexico. Why? Because Mexico became the ATM. Mexico was where the money was. Starting in 1546, Spaniards came across bottomless mountains of silver. And that would fund the first great global empire in human history, the Spanish Empire, right? And so what Vasconcelos says is that the discovery of these mountains of silver brought people from all over the planet, either willingly as traders from, say, the Far East, or unwillingly as slaves from Africa, right, to Mexico. And what that meant is that Mexico became the global frontera. And you started to see the mingling of cultures from throughout the planet happen in Mexico first, right? Now, one of the things that would happen as a result of this concept that Vasconcelos came up with is that people would go nuts over it, right? Starting in Mexico and then all over the Americas, right? People would say, that's it. That explains us, right? The problem with that is that at the very center of Vasconcelos' vision of the world was the idea of white supremacy. And this would eventually become kind of the linchpin that leaders of Latin American societies would grab onto to say, this is why we deserve to be in charge, right? Because mestizaje, the process that creates mestizos, is wonderful. But the reality is, it leads to one superior group of people, the white mestizos. I'm sorry, I fit into that, right? Not everybody does. My father didn't. My father was a freak of nature. He was 6 feet tall and as dark as the night is long, right? The height came from the Spanish in him, the complexion from the Indian in him, right? You know, I used to say fondly of my father, he passed away from COVID last year. I used to say that if he stood outside in the dark and he didn't smile, you didn't see him, right? I mean, he was pretty dark skinned, right? The reality is that as time progresses, this concept of the cosmic race got tied in with white supremacy as people who were in charge of society, in charge of politics in various Latin American countries latched onto it as a means of saying this is why white people should be in charge. This is why you see the book that I'm projecting onto the screen now. It is a book that is a laudatory book about the concept of the cosmic race. But the title, you see, is Rise and Fall of the Cosmic Race, because the author, right, Professor Miller, basically argues that this white supremacy becomes one of the real Achilles heels of it, right, and really drags it down as a result of it, right? Now, I think that there's a bit of classism in that, because what you have essentially is mestizaje being decided, the definition of it being decided by people who are at the top of society, be they academics or politicians or wealthy people, whatever. And this is not the way mestizaje works. Now, to make sure we're on the same page, mestizaje is the way you make mestizos, right? It is a process by which mestizos are created. And mestizaje is the logic of the Americas. It is the way the history of the Americas has played out over the course of the last 3, 4, actually, now we're taking a look at almost 500 years, right? Now, mestizaje was created as a means of answering a real problem that the Spanish had when they came to the Americas. And the problem was that the Spaniards were racists, right? They believed, just like cultures before them and after them, that they were God's gift to humanity, right? And that everything they did was for the betterment of the human race. So there was no way that they were wrong. Even when they started wiping out Indians in the New World by the millions, there were many people back in Spain who said, the Indians kind of had it coming, right? If they didn't want to get killed, they should have conquered us. But we conquered them. We have the right to do whatever we do to them, right? That was a really prevalent thought in Spain of the 1500s. And part of the reason for that was because the Spaniards were obsessed with a concept that they referred to as la limpieza de sangre, the cleanliness of blood, right? What they were getting at is that they believed, just like everybody else in the 1500s did, that your culture was determined by your blood. If you were French, it's because you had French blood. Irish, Irish blood. Portuguese, Portuguese blood. Indian, Indian blood. African, African blood. Spaniard, Spaniard blood, right? And so they believed that blood was the carrier of culture. And then they came to the Americas and they encountered a massive problem. Everybody there wasn't Spanish. They're all inferior. And my God, they're everywhere. Even when the Spaniards started killing off a lot of them through mistreatment, through torture, mostly by diseases, to be sure, right? If you want to take a look at an example of this, you can see it in the Aztec Empire in Mexico, right? Historians estimate that by the time the Spaniards conquered the Aztecs, I'm sorry, backtrack a little bit. By the time they encountered the Aztecs in 1519, there were 25 million people living under Aztec rule. 60 years later, the census that the Spaniards did of the same area that the Aztecs used to rule showed only 1.5 million Indians. That means a loss of 23.5 million Indians over the course of 60 years. That, folks, is the textbook example of genocide. And the Spaniards did this everywhere they went in the Americas, right? So the question that they had was this: even despite the mass disappearance of the Indians, they still vastly outnumber us. And a lot of us are coming over as guys, right? You don't have a lot of conquistadoras coming across the ocean, right? Women conquistadores, right? There are some. Cortés had a woman named Maria de Estrada, for example, with him, and she fought during the battle to conquer the Aztec Empire. But there were only 3 more of her with Cortés, and there weren't more than a handful of these conquistadores anywhere else as the Spaniards traveled throughout the Americas, right? So these Spaniards, they come across the ocean as an almost wholly male group, right? And they're looking to get married, to have kids. And they end up having to choose the Indians, right? Now, this is a problem because if you're a Spaniard and you're marrying an Indian, you're going to have a kid with a woman who is inferior to you by blood and culture. And your kid's going to have a problem with that too, because your kid's going to be half and half superior, half inferior. That kid would be a mestizo. So there's nothing you can do about that kid, just like there's nothing you can do about mom. They're both inferior. But what you can do with the kid is wait for the kid to grow up and marry the kid off to another Spaniard. What you end up with there is something called a castizo, a person who is 2/3 Spaniard, 1/3 Indian. Not good, but better. And then you take that castizo and you marry that castizo off to a Spaniard. And you end up with a person who is 88%, if you look at the percentages, 88% Spanish, 12% Indian. Not completely right, but close enough. The Spaniards would call that person Español, a Spaniard. And so what they came up with was the concept of mestizaje, right? The means of cleaning people's blood, right? by intermarriage. And they came up with a whole bunch of different possible racial combinations for that because of the fact that there would eventually be people from all over the world. You see these little pictures here, they're thumbnails, unfortunately. You can find this online if you Google the phrase casta paintings, right? They'll show you what the Spaniards thought this process of mestizaje should be, right? These casta paintings that you see here projected onto your screen basically start off here in the corner with a Spaniard and an Indian having a little mestizo kid. The mestizo grows up to be a castiza in this case, marries a Spaniard. They end up with a kid who is going to be, for all intents and purposes, Espanol. But then as you go through, you start to see how Spaniards can mess it up by marrying with inferior people. And the names that they come up with are ridiculous, right? They have people who are mixing with black folks. Those people become known as mulattoes. Oh, I think a lot of people have heard that term, but they haven't heard the term lobos, wolves, right? They call them wolves. And there are others. If you had the wrong kind of mixture, you could end up with people who were tornatraces, turning away, like they're turning away from the proper cultural mixture. They would have saltatraces, jumping up, right? People who were literally jumping backwards culturally and in their blood. And these people were inferior to the Spaniards. The Spaniards created a five-tier um, society in the Americas. At the very top were the purebred Spaniards who were born in Spain. These were called peninsulares. Underneath them, there were the criollos, the Creoles, purebred Spaniards, but people who were raised in the Americas, born in the Americas. And then there were the mestizos. The mestizos were split into two different groups depending on what your complexion was. Euro mestizos and Afro mestizos. The Euro mestizos look like me, white. The Afro mestizos could be anything past that, brown to very dark, right? Underneath that, you had the Indios, and then finally the slaves. Surely the Spaniards judged people by how much money they had, but they also judged them by the limpieza de sangre, by how clean their blood was, right? And what you ended up with, right, were a lot of different racial possibilities because Mexico, more than any place else, would eventually become the center of the first global empire in human history. Now, don't get me wrong, some very talented painters put their efforts into creating these so-called casta paintings. This is arguably the most well-known of them. The picture of the Spaniard with the Indian and the mestizo, right? Mestiza, sorry. So as a result of this, right, what you start to see is essentially what the Spaniards intend for this process to be. They intend it as a means of cleaning everybody's blood in the Americas. The problem is Spaniards never amounted to more than 15% of the population of the empire that they created in the Americas. In other words, to make this work the way the Spaniards intended it, and the way people have understood mestizaje ever since as a means of creating a white superior culture over everybody else, right? You needed to have large amounts of Spaniards, and that simply was never available to them. There just simply weren't enough Spaniards in Spain, much less in the Americas. And so what ended up happening is instead of people becoming more pure in their blood, and what they mean is their culture, right? They started to become less Spaniard. And you see reasons for that in the life and times of people such as this guy, Gaspar Yanga. Gaspar is a Spanish name. Yanga means that he was a prince from Western Africa. I guarantee you he was not called Gaspar when he was born. He was captured by the Spaniards, who were the first great slave traders in world history, by the way. Intercontinental slave traders, I'm sorry. The Spaniards had come to the New World with the idea of enslaving the Indians. But then they were told by the Spanish government that they couldn't do that anymore. And so they looked around and they said, well, what can we do now? The answer was clear. The Indians are made in the image of God, just like the Spanish people are, but not the Africans. Sick 'em. And so the Spanish government started going after African populations with gusto, as they say. They went after them for the first time in world history and brought them across the ocean as slaves. Now, the process that they had for them to turn free human beings into slaves was to bring people such as Yanga to Cuba, an island nation from which there was no escape, and beat the freedom out of them. Unless they were women, then you would beat and rape the freedom out of them. And as soon as you saw the light of freedom die in their eyes, they were ready to be sold on the mainland. This is what happened to Yanga. He was beaten mercilessly in Cuba. And then eventually, when people thought, we got him, they brought him to Veracruz, not knowing that he was lying to them. He was just waiting for an opportunity to run. And when they landed on Veracruz, he had already communicated in his native language with all of the other people who were there with him, all the other Africans, that they needed to book it. They needed to get out of there. And so as a result of that, as soon as they land at the port of Veracruz, Yanga and his men kill the people who had enslaved them and then run off into the countryside. For 30 years, the Spanish government chased after these people, could not find them, right? In that time, the Catholic Church had an epiphany about Africans. The epiphany was simple. Maybe they're people too. And if they are, we can't enslave them. And so, at the behest of the Spanish Catholic Church in the Americas, the Spanish government in Mexico offered Yanga and his men freedom if they would surrender. And folks, this is the greatest leap of faith I think I've ever seen in history. Yanga and his men took them up on it. Took the Spanish, who could not be trusted as far as they could throw them, they took them up on their offer of freedom so they could stop running and they could live in peace with the families they had created over the past 3 decades with the Indian women. And as a result of this, the Spanish government did something remarkable. They gave them freedom. The Indians, Africans, Spaniards started to intermarry. At that time in history, if you were a slave and you wanted to be free, all you had to do was fall in love. Go to your local priest and get married, and then later have a child with your wife or husband. After you did that, all you had to do is go back to the priest, pay the equivalent of like $10 in today's money, and he would fill out a form that would give you freedom. That's it. You'll remember what blacks had to go through here in this country and what the United States had to go through to win freedom for the Africans living here. In Spain, it was done with a stroke of a pen. Now, that being said, as black people started to intermarry into the local population, they obviously started to leave not only their genetic code, but some of their culture in the children who were coming out of these marriages, right? This is one of the reasons why many of you have probably met at least one Mexicano with an afro, right? That is the African in us expressing itself. And there is more of it than you know. I guarantee you, not just me, but any Mexican American who's listening to me today could go back into their family history. And if they could trace it back 500 years, I guarantee you, you will find at least one black person and probably a lot more. Now, you're going to find Indians. Eventually, you're going to find Asians, right? Specifically, folks from China, right? Chinese people become not enmeshed. They're never conquered by the Spanish, but they become very active traders with the Spanish. And as a result of that, they start coming across the ocean with the intent of selling stuff that they make in Spain. So they come across the Pacific And where do they land? Mexico, right? Every Mexican American or Mexicano knows what to do when you see the Buddha. You rub his tummy, he gives you good luck. Maybe money. You never can tell. The story changes. What should Mexicanos know about a prince from the country of India who lived 2,000 plus years ago? The answer is nothing. The reason we know that is because of the fact that the Spanish built this first global empire in world history and encouraged Chinese businessmen to come across the ocean in the hope of getting to Spain to sell their stuff. But here's the thing. If you land in a country such as Mexico that's got people with money in their pockets and you're trying to sell stuff, you sell stuff. So imagine what happens. Some guy comes across the ocean and he's got like a box full of Buddhas, right? He wants to sell them back in Spain. He opens up a little table in some square in some town and he says, there's the Buddhas. Here's the opportunity for you to buy it. Somebody comes up and says, how much is it? $1. $1. How many of you have ever bought something for $1 that you don't need, right? So you buy this thing. You give the guy $1, he gives you a statue of the Buddha. What do you want to know about it? You ask the guy, ¿Qué indica? What is it? The guy tells you, Buddha is one of the most important philosophers in world history. He came up with the eightfold path to enlightenment. 8 things that you're supposed to do every single day so that you can be happy in this life. It includes right concentration, right vocation, right job, right thinking, right something else, something else, something else. I can never remember the other 5. This is why I'm always pissed off, right? But the reality is, Buddhists, they have 8 things they're supposed to do every single day. And if they do them, they will be happy in this life. So, you go, you buy the thing. This is the first time you've ever heard of what Buddhists call the Eightfold Path. You go over to your friend. Mira, lo que me hallé. What did you find? It's a statue of the Buddha. What is it? I don't know. He explained it to me for like 20 minutes. Something about rubbing his stomach and he gives you money. That's the way mestizaje works. We see examples of this all over our lives. In every imaginable part of Mexican and Mexican American culture, you see the stamp of mestizaje, but not the stamp that the people in charge think is being placed, the one that says white people are better than everybody else. You see one coming from the bottom, from the people, from the group Mariano Azuela called los de abajo, the people at the bottom of society. They are the ones who start to blend the cultures that come across their lives into new and exciting forms, right? They start to do this quickly. It is a vital process, this process of cultural blending that is called mestizaje. It is a process that is organic. It depends on where you are to understand what kind of mestizo you become, right? A mestizo, for example, from Argentina is not going to be the same kind of mestizo as you find in Mexico. And you know what? There are large numbers of mestizos living in what is now called the United States of America. And you know very clearly that mestizos in the United States of America are not all the same. Think about this. Is a California Mexican American the same as a Texas Mexican American? And even within Texas, you have different kinds of Mexican Americans. And what I mean by that is different kinds of mestizos, right? People from a line going from San Antonio, from Corpus to Laredo. North of that line, you're going to find Mexican American culture that is very different from the one that you find south of it, right? There is an historian named Daniel Arriola who called that the Taco Barbacoa border, right? Below the line from Corpus to Laredo, you find nothing but barbacoa. You go north of that, the barbacoa starts to disappear, and you see tacos everywhere you go. He says this is an indication that even within one small part of the country, right, the southern tip of Texas, you can find different kinds of mestizos, right? Now, okay. Now, here is where, look, a lot of history plays out by accident, right? People set out to do things, and they end up doing the exact opposite, right? And they don't even know how they end up doing the exact opposite of what they want to do, but they do, right? And as fate would have it, this particular lesson applies to what I'm talking about now, because the Spanish had in their history an indication that they could peaceably mix their culture with other people who were really dissimilar to them in a lot of ways, right? The book you see in front of you is a remarkable one, Ornament of the World by Maria Rosa Menocal, right? Muslims, Jews, and Christians created a culture of tolerance in medieval Spain. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because if you have ever turned on the news or taken a look at a website, a news website, you know that historically, wherever these three groups of Muslims, Jews, and Christians get together, they don't tend to like each other. They tend to have a lot of problems with each other. Lots. That was not the way medieval Spain played out. In 711, Muslims conquered Spain. Muslims from a part of Western Africa that we now know as Mauritania, the Maure, would conquer Spain in the year 711, right? Actually, 3 years, from 711 to 714. And as a result of that, these Maure would not only conquer Spain, they would end up staying there for a while, like 800 years. And during that time, they came to the conclusion that as a minority population that was mostly Christian, with a small group of people who were Jewish, they had one of two things they could do. They could either forcibly convert these people or allow these people to continue to be who they were and hope that they would one day convert to Islam. You do it the first way, I guarantee you they would lose. The Moros, as they came to be known, would lose because they would be outnumbered by the Christians. So they tried to force their religion onto the Christians would annihilate them. The fact that they were there for 800 years means that they didn't do this. What they ended up doing instead is trying to treat the Jews and Muslims as human beings, equal to the Muslims of what came to be known as Al-Andalus. And what this meant is that you would start to see for the first time a really unique culture pop up in Europe, one that was syncretic, right? One that melded the traditions of Christianity, of Judaism, and of Islam. Now, they're all closely tied in that they all come from the same root. Judaism first gave rise to Christianity. We're in the middle of Easter, you know that Jesus was a rabbi, right? A Jewish holy man. And then out of those two religious traditions, Islam would eventually pop up, right? 600 years or so after the crucifixion of Christ, Islam would pop up in the Middle East. And they all worship the same God. In Judaism, it's Yahweh. Christianity, God. In Islam, it's Allah, the God. But they're all the same person. And eventually, when Muslims come and take over Spain in the 700s, they come to realize that the best way to govern the people they had conquered is to recognize that fact and to treat them accordingly. What you see here is something called the Great Mosque of Cordoba, right? And what you see is a mixture in styles between columns that come from the Christian tradition and arches that are the shapes that come from Islam. They're called onion dome shapes, right? Although this is not a dome, it's an arch, right? They make the domes in the same basic shape, right? And so if you take a look at these things clearly, right? I'm kind of giving away. You see how it's got this kind of a rounded shape here, right? That you see only in the Muslim world and in Spain. There is only one other example of this style of architecture, which would come to be called mudéjar, right? It's a mixture of Spanish and Jewish and Christian architectural styles, right? There's only one other place in the world you can see this mudéjar style of architecture, and it's right here. This is in San Antonio, Texas. This is Mission Espada. And if you take a look at this thing, you see something called pareidolia. It looks like a face looking at you, right? The nose, the two eyes, whatever, right? But if you zoom in on the door, there's a picture here where I did that. You see that? It's not exactly the onion dome, the onion-shaped arch that you see in the Great Mosque of Cordoba, but it's pretty close. And I guarantee you, the Spanish architects who built this church, they would have been greatly familiar with the mudéjar style, because the mudéjar style of these arches, of this type of architecture, had been in Spain for about 1,000 years by the time the Spaniards built this building in San Antonio. So they knew very well what this style of architecture looked like. You go there today, the national park rangers who work there will say, no, 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 there's no Muslim here, right? I think they do that just so they don't spook the tourists, to be honest with you. The reality is there's a pretty close relationship between this and the Great Mosque that I showed you before. Now, where does this all leave us, right? How does this relate to people living here? I want to go back to Vasconcelos really quickly, right? Vasconcelos, like I said, is a broken clock, right? Write twice a day. What he ended up writing in the good parts of Raza Cósmica was stuff like this. He said, eventually, communication will make the world a smaller place. This is in 1925, he's writing this. He says, eventually, we will be able to talk to people very quickly on other sides of the planet. Now, again, there's no way he could have predicted the interwebs, but the reality is we're here, right? And he said, as communication makes the world a smaller place, we're going to start to learn something about people living in other parts of the world. What we're going to start to see is ourselves in them. And as we start to see ourselves in them, our prejudices will start to melt away. He says, not only will we start to see other people who are not like us as human beings, but eventually we might start to actually become interested in things like dating them, right? We won't see anything wrong with a white person dating a black one, for example, because we're all human beings. We're all members of the same family, right? The human family. And when this happens, he says, and children are created, we will not so much see children being born and raised as we will see the creation of cultural works of art. He says mestizos are all over the Americas. And the reality is, you don't have to be Indian and Spanish to be a mestizo. You can be black and still be a mestizo. You can be white and still be a mestizo. You just have to be open-minded to the idea that other people aren't foreigners. They're your sisters and your brothers. Now, all throughout the Americas, mestizos have been growing in massive numbers for centuries. And they have eventually come to power in one Latin American country after another. There's only one of them where that hasn't happened, the United States of America. But it's starting to now. And this makes people very nervous. The mestizos of this country are not only the largest ethnic group, but they're also the fastest growing ethnic minority. And there are people who are saying that by the middle of this century, mestizos will go from being an ethnic minority to an ethnic majority. So where are we now? Fastest growing ethnic group, largest ethnic minority. Raza, I think we need a new hobby. The reality is, video games maybe, I don't know. The reality is that the growing number of mestizos in this country does make people nervous, right? If they are unclear about what being a mestizo means. A mestizo doesn't mean you're a particular cultural or racial mixture. It means you are open-minded to things, to ideas, to people who are not like you. That's why Vasconcelos says eventually we will start to see in the Americas, before anywhere else, the birth of a new race. What he means by that is a new culture. The one that will represent the wisdom and the treasures of all the other races that have come before it. And again, he's talking about culture. He says this race will be the final race, the cosmic race. And if you want this chance to see what that looks like, I'm going to wave my geek flag now. Star Trek, The New Generation. That is what Vasconcelos is writing about. If you've ever watched that, you know that there are people from all over the universe, all over the multiverse, whatever, and they all work on the Enterprise, right? When you have a Klingon who knows about Cole Porter music, you're looking at a mestizo, right? When you're looking at a person who says, like Captain Picard says in one of the movies, right, that we've gone past the acquisition of wealth, we try to better ourselves. He is talking about being a mestizo, right? And what you see here in the United States is mestizos are the fastest growing ethnic group in this country, right? But we're also a people who are being exposed to a new cultural idea that we're taking into ourselves for the first time really in our history. And you can see that in places such as the Rio Grande Valley, right? We have been exposed to an economic idea that is not as open-minded or not open-minded for the right reason as mestizaje. It's called capitalism. Capitalism can pander to different cultural groups, but that's all it does. You can have, for example, companies say, we support the Cinco de Mayo. How do they support it? By trying to get you drunk, right? That's not the way mestizaje works, right? Mestizaje is not something that's forced down your throat. It's something that you yourself choose, right? But here's the problem. When mestizos are taught capitalism, they're taught on one hand that they need to be open-minded to different points of view, and on the other hand, maybe not so much. Maybe you shouldn't be. Capitalism and racism have a very long history of working together well. However, mestizaje ain't like that. Mestizaje is like this. You see her? I don't know if you can. Ah, there you go. Reina. Selena. Selena is mestizaje incarnate. If you wanted a patron saint of mestizaje in the United States, it would be La Reina Selena Quintanilla Perez, right? What you see here in the United States is an active mestizaje that you've seen all over the rest of the Americas, but it's starting to happen here now, right? And you see this in every imaginable way. I'm going to give you one simple example of it. How many of you have ever eaten sausages with eggs? Of course, we don't call them sausages. We call them hot dogs. Chop them up into little pieces, put them in, blanquillos, salsa, put it in a tortilla, and there you go. Perfect breakfast meal, right? Hot dogs are sausages. You're not supposed to eat them that way. Germans eat sausages with beer, right? And the reality is, we took a look at what the Germans were doing with their sausages that we call hot dogs, and we were saying, no, you did that all stupid. Mira, this is what you need to do, right? And now you got it perfect. Weenies and eggs with salsa inside a flour tortilla, mestizaje. And you see this all over places such as South Texas, Tejano music, mestizaje, right? Everywhere you look at culture down here, right? You see mestizaje at play. This is where we are. As the United States of America, we are coming to grips right now with what it means to have a very large mestizo population in it. And a lot of people are very uncomfortable about that without the recognition that it doesn't take much to become a mestizo. Mestizo doesn't mean Spanish and Indian. It means open-mindedness to new ideas. When I moved down to the Rio Grande Valley, I'm not from here. My kid is fifth generation, but I was not born here. I was born and raised in Houston. And when I came down to Lozano, actually Lantana, and if you can find that on your map, on the map, I'll give you an A for this. When I came to Lantana, right, one of the first people I met was a guy who spoke Spanish perfectly. He was about 5'1". He was a little old white farmer named Franklin Ricker. He spoke Spanish perfectly. I mean, with the accent and everything, right? And when I talked to him one day and I asked him, why did you learn Spanish? He said, I live in Lozano. Everybody around me speaks Spanish. If I want to talk to people, I got to speak Spanish. That's open-mindedness. Franklin Ricker, the old white guy, who I knew, was a mestizo. So the question that we now have is, what do we do with our mestizos, right? A lot of people are trying to figure that out. There are some people who say, you know what, mestizos don't represent traditional U.S. culture. We need to make sure to keep traditional U.S. ideas alive. There are other people who say, as Vasconcelos did, right, that eventually this new race, this mestizo culture, will become the culture of the world. He said very clearly, mestizos will never conquer the world by force. They'll do it by love and through open-mindedness. Sean?
Yeah, thank you. It is unsettling seeing this this clash, perhaps confusion. I'm just thinking of the El Paso shooter who published a manifesto or put it out there in social media, and his justification for killing all of those people in the Walmart in El Paso was he felt that his country, the United States, Texas in particular, was being invaded. So yeah, it's an important topic to try to understand exactly.
There are a couple of these slides that I didn't get to, Sean. I'm sorry, and I apologize to the students as well. I just kind of started talking, whatever. I hope some of this was correct, for example. But I wanted to leave with this image here. This is by the famed Mexican muralist Jose Clemente Orozco, and it's called Cortés en Malinche, right? And what you see here is El Conquistador, the first of them, the conqueror, Hernán Cortés, and Doña Marina, the woman who he would take, who would help him conquer the Aztecs, and then who he would eventually give to a friend of his as a birthday gift because he didn't want to be involved with her anymore. Cortés was a really good guy, as you can see, right? Cortés and Marina are depicted here, naked as like Adam and Eve, right? And what you see at their feet, at Cortés's feet specifically, is a dead adult. Now, there are a lot of different ways of explaining who this dead adult is. I think it's their kid, Martín Cortés el Mestizo. You see, Cortés has his foot on it. That is supposed to represent the Spaniards' desire to clamp down on mestizo culture, to make it what they thought it should be, a white culture. And you see with his left arm him holding Marina back. A woman who had given birth to a kid who is now dead in front of her might want to actually go and hug the kid. Cortés says, no, stay away. This is the way people who criticize mestizaje, who criticize the cosmic race, see it. But the reality is, it ain't that way. It's the way I just talked about. It's the hot dog and eggs in salsa and in flour tortillas. That's mestizaje. All right. Now I'm done, Sean.
Yeah. Any student here, you have a question or a comment, please either open up your mic or get us in the chat box. We have one student that put in the chat box, the U.S. is the most diverse country in the world. The greatness of the country is the promise of freedom and opportunity.
Yeah, can I add that I have the definition of capitalism, and the thing about capitalism is how great it is and how diverse and beneficial is for humanity. As for the example that some author that I read have talked about the pencil, like the pencil is a conglomerate of different things and different peoples that they don't know each other and might hate each other. But the great thing about capitalism is that makes people work together to form better things without the necessary need to know each other.
That's an interesting point, and yes, there is a reason that somebody could be able to argue that point. I mean, it is a point that can be easily defended. One of the things that I would add to that is that capitalism functions very well as a racist system, but it also functions very well as a non-racist system. It can. And it can bring out the best in people. It doesn't always work out that way. For example, one of the best, I don't want to use the term example, one of the best examples of how capitalism can work in a very, very bad way is the Opium War that England started in 1839 in China. Right. The point behind that was to try to get the Chinese government to allow the people of China to start buying English goods. The people of China didn't want English goods. And so the English said, there's got to be something wrong with the Chinese. We got it. It's because they're all high on opium. So they started handing out free samples of opium. And then when a lot of people got hooked and couldn't afford to buy any more opium, the English started bombarding them so as to get them to buy more opium. Right? Now, that's English. Right? But you see a lot of examples of that all over the history of capitalism, right? Where capitalism can work in a really, really nasty way. The best example of that in the United States, agricultural capitalism before the Civil War, right? Where black people were commodities, right? I remember one time going to the port of Savannah, Georgia, right? A port where Africans were brought in large numbers. And I remember talking to one of the national park people there, and I said, wow. I said, this must be a terrible place to look at because the port, it still looks very much today the way it did in the 1700s when it functioned as a slave trading post, right? And I talked to the national park ranger who was African American, and I said, this has got to be a very hard place for you to work. He says, why? It's full of so much history. I said, yes, bad history. And I saw like this light bulb come over the man's head, like he had never thought of that before, that this is where people who look like him had been sold as property, right? So that being said, right, capitalism works very well as a racist system, but it doesn't always have to be that. And when it's not, it may look like it's open-minded, but think about the Cinco de Mayo again. And then here's one last thing I'd like to say. This is not to state that communism is better than capitalism. It's not, right? But if you take a look at things such as the exploration of space, the communists beat us to a lot of things before we got our acts in gear and beat them to the moon. And one of the things you'll note about that, if you ever take a look at the first phone call from Earth to the moon, Richard Nixon calls up and says, I want to thank everybody, the Apollo astronauts. He tells them, I want to thank everybody who made this possible, even the people in the Soviet Union. That was him giving one of these fingers to the Russians. We beat you. And it wasn't always clear that that would happen.
Yeah, and I agree. Some of the things that the Soviets and the communists have done are indeed really great. For example, the women rights and stuff like that, that they actually made more advances on that. But the thing is, I can argue, like for example, capitalism can be also used for bad things, and it's true. But the main thing about capitalism is that even if racism exists, is not necessary because of capitalism. It's more about culture.
Well,
Culture
to be
is
sure,
not yeah,
I can give you a very simple a simple example of how you're right. Okay, you ready for this?
sure.
I've already gotten my 2 doses of Pfizer, and you know how fast that vaccine was created. I mean, it was done, they called it warp speed, right? Operation Warp Speed. And that, I think, is capitalism in its best expression, right? Because that was super quick, that we were able to identify the vulnerable points of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, right? Coronavirus 2, and we're able to identify its vulnerabilities and then defeat it, right, with a simple syringe, right? Now, coming up with vaccines is a very, very long process, and I'm sure that everybody has been keeping up with this knows that it sometimes takes years and years and years, right? The capitalist United States did it in what, Sean? Like 8 months, 9 months?
Well, yeah, they were able to expedite some long-standing studies that had been going on. So it wasn't exactly that they did it in 8 months, but they were able to, through the process of law, expedite studies that were already in process.
To be sure. Now, I'm not a fan of capitalism, but to buttress the student's point, I think that the vaccines are a very good example of how capitalism can work well without being racist.
Yeah, and part of to harken it back to the topic at hand, as mestizos is an opportunity for open-mindedness. I think the problem that we find where capitalism goes wrong and contributes to closed-mindedness is when we don't, as a society, as a culture, look at this economic system as just a tool, and instead look at it as this work of nature that is just part and parcel of what it means to be here on the planet. It's a fiction. It's a tool to help organize economies. And I think where we go wrong with it is when we don't look at industries that have a perverse profit motive. And there's a number of ones that we could look at that. Healthcare is certainly one that has a perverse profit motive when you're making money on people who are sick and dying. Or private prisons is also a industry that has a perverse profit motive where the actual profit motive is leading to the misery of other human beings. Christopher Gomez, see you out there. If you just want to turn on your mic and chime in, please do.
A very lucid, I would even dare say beautiful talk you just gave us. I've always been very, very interested in Vasconcelos.
Gracias.
De nada. I've always been very interested in Vasconcelos and Raza Cósmica, and also in his later period, where he shows his Catholic colors, let's say, almost in a raging way, I would dare say. Well, first of all, just to add to the anecdotes of Soviet Union, the U.S. and the space race, I've always loved that anecdote where the NASA spent $10 million or more to develop the ballpoint pen so they could write in zero gravity.
Right.
The Soviets took a pencil, right? So I love that anecdote.
Indeed.
It's very telling of many things. Okay, so regarding Vasconcelos' Catholicism, I think that might come into play also in La Raza Cósmica. I mean, it's evident later when he writes Aesthetic and the 2 books called Aesthetic and Aesthetic. But it's maybe not so evident in La Raza Cósmica. But I think he does make some points of 2 types of West, right? Like a Catholic, Iberian, Southern West, so to speak, Catholic, and he would add the Italians to that, of course, a Latin West. And then contrasting to that, a Northern Protestant, and in a sense more racist West.
Right.
So I sometimes like to read that in a sense like challenging a caricature of Catholicism as an oppressive religion, that the religion of the counter-reform, and Spain being the country of the counter-reform, and where science was not allowed to be developed and so on, right? which is in a sense like the caricature that I think it's Max Weber, the one that mostly develops that, right? Why was science developed in Protestant countries? Because they were freer or something like that.
Right.
But the way that Catholics treat their slaves and the way the Protestants treat their slaves is very telling of a difference, of a more tolerance on the side of the Catholics. And I don't know if this is relevant or not, but for example, there's a story that perhaps jazz and many other musical expressions were developed in New Orleans, in the Delta of the Mississippi, because most of the slave owners there were French Catholic, and they would be more tolerant of the cultural expressions of their slaves. They would allow them to play their drums in Congo Square, which is today Louis Armstrong Park, I think.
Right.
Which is something that the Protestants would never allow their slaves to do. So that's something of an opposite of the contradictory story that Max Weber sold us, right? That of Catholics being closed and Protestants being open. It seems almost like the exact opposite of that. And I think Vasconcelos allows us to read a bit into that as well.
Right. This is something that I just touched on very, very briefly, colega, earlier on in the speech, right? Because the Catholic Church is not exactly known for its open-mindedness, right? Yeah. You think about the Catholic Church, especially in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, before. I mean, this is look, and it takes a long time for them to recognize and admit mistakes. I mean, you may remember when John Paul II had that remarkable news conference where he apologized to Galileo Galilei.
Only took 500 years.
Right, no mas. It only took him 500 years to recognize that the sun was the center of the universe, right? And I think he said it's something like, we may have been mistaken or something like that. It was just a masterpiece of understatement. But, the reality is that the Catholic Church does something remarkable when it comes to African and Indian cultures, right? With Indian cultures, the Spaniards were predisposed to just kill them. I mean, when they came across the ocean and they conquered the Mexica, the people we know as the Aztecs, and the Inca, and then they didn't find any more rich Indians, they were almost thinking, pues Chihuahuas, we should just leave, at least nobody got hurt, right? And, leave behind a pile of Indian corpses. And it wasn't until Bartolomé de las Casas convinced the king of Spain, while he was still a prince, Felipe II, right, that the Indians, like the Spaniards, were made in the image of God, that mistreatment started to stop, right? It didn't stop immediately from one day to the next, obviously, but it began to stop under the leadership of Felipe II, who from the mid-1500s, the late 1550s, I'm sorry, started to enforce the new laws of 1542, which mandated an end to the mistreatment of the Indians, right?
Yes.
De las Casas, of course, had his weak point, when people said, hey, Bartolomé, what do we do now? Who do we enslave? He says, well, you can't do it to the Indians because they, like us, are made in the image of God. But the Africans, that's a whole other thing, right? Yeah. And he later repented saying that, obviously. But, the genie was out of the bottle. But then by the time of the early 1600s, in the dealings with Yanga, you see the church doing something really remarkable here that is, to my mind, unprecedented. And really out of character for him, to be honest with you. But again, possibly, I would argue, probably a nod to the mestizo nature of the population by that point.
Interesting. Yeah, in a sense, what to say? The thing is that Vasconcelos shows the two sides of the Catholic Church on his writings. He shows this a bit more openness, right? A better treatment of the slaves, the Indians, the outlawed slavery of the Indians, in no small part thanks to the dispute between De las Casas and Sepulveda. But then also in no small part thanks to De las Casas, Africans were brought here against their own will. Mm-hmm. And Vasconcelos shows this as well, because in the second part of his life, let's say when he's writing Aesthetica, there's really no other way to see that but as a fanatic. He kind of shows that ugly side also. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. An intolerant fanatic, even.
I've never read anything else by him, so you are my expert here, but I have read about this side of him, and it's so nice.
The books of these books that are, one of them, La Estética, is still in print in Spanish by editorial called Austral, I think. It's a small book. But there's another one, a bigger one, called Just Estética. and boy, it is a rant. I would dare say it's a fanatic rant. That's what it is, honestly.
Well, I went to a conference one time where people were roundly dismissing Vasconcelos, for a lot of different reasons. You just mentioned some very good ones, right? And I turned to one of our colleagues, William Carter, who was at the same meeting, and I said, I don't understand what they're doing here. And I spoke up and I said, look, Vasconcelos isn't all bad. There's some good stuff in here. And they say, pues, what do you do with the bad stuff? I said, throw it away. Get rid of it. Use it as a building block, for Christ's sake. Sorry. Use it as a building block for new ideas. I mean, that's
he's
the way it works.
A complex figure for sure. And I really appreciate the interpretation that you gave to his brighter side.
Thank you. I appreciate that, colega.
Thank you, Gilberto.
I forgot where he was. Ya ni pa qué. Sean, we still on?
Yes, I was just on mute while you guys were talking.
Okay.
There's the man. Yeah, he had he was sympathetic to Nazi Germany as well. I think that was out of more of his distrust of the United States and seeing Hitler as a convenient friend.
His distrust to market capitalism as well, it seems, and to Protestant culture, or at least to, it's complex. He edited a magazine called Timon, which was like an organ of propaganda for the National Socialist Party in Germany. But the Mexican government did something with all of that. They kind of all hid it under the rug, because Vasconcelos for the PRI, mentioned by Gilberto, is a very important figure. He was like the official philosopher of the revolution, of the revolutionary period. So they took care in tailoring his image and selling that image of the revolutionary philosopher to school kids in Mexico. And among the things they did for that was kind of hide his Nazi sympathies. So I know a researcher that was into that and trying to find these magazines in the National Archive in Mexico, the Timon, the magazines, actual copies, and he didn't find many. Many of them were in the system, but they're not there. The copies are not there. So that seems telling of the Mexican government trying to do something there with the image of Vasconcelos.
I know that this is going to minimize this, but to be sure, right? Every culture has its little sayings about the way the world operates, and there's one that came to mind, un dicho, cada quien tiene sus defectos. Everybody's got their defects, right? He's got every big ones.
For sure, for sure. We're talking about a living, breathing, complex human being. Definitely.
This brings up something else, and I'd be curious to know what you think about this, Professor Gomez. The nature of contradiction that's at the heart of Mexican and Mexican-American culture has been written about extensively by Octavio Paz, right?
Yes.
And, Paz basically says that we are, by nature, contradictions because of this missing part of us, right? That has been ripped away by the Spaniards, by the conquest, right? What do you think of that? Is he right there?
There is something to his description of Malinchismo. And then in his Labyrinth of Solitude, he dedicates a whole chapter to Mexican Americans, right? Which he generalizes as Chicano culture.
The Pachuco and other extremes, right?
I think
there's another one.
Sorry?
Pachuco and other extremes. The first chapter.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, but Pachuco's Chicano. Yeah, it kind of became kind of interchangeable terms. Now, there's a reading from Philosophy of Liberation, Enrique Dussel and other philosophers that say that original thought is born in these kind of conflicting areas. But the conflicting areas, especially the conflict that people have with their own identity, when that's a thing in a culture that and part of us that accepts part of our legacy, right? Like Mexicans are very proud of the pyramids, but they're not very proud of the living Indians at the same time. So that's like a
The
living.
Indians didn't make them; the gods did, right?
Well, I mean, it's like saying, oh, the Indians of the past, they were these great pyramid builders and great cultures. And when you talk to them, or in general to them, I should say to us, about the living Indians today, then we're not so proud. We say, no, well, no, they're marginalized people and they're not really part of Mexico and so on. Right? So that's a living contradiction, right, between a dead past and a living present, which each one of us holds in himself or herself as passes thesis. And I do tend to agree with that. But then, as the philosophers of liberation would say, well, that's actually a window of opportunity for all of us, because original thought is created in the, so to speak, fringes of the empire, in the outskirts of the empire, in places where people have identity crisis, like it seems many Mexican mestizos do still today.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak,
Right.
to this machismo. That's it's not my reading. I wish it was my. It's the philosophers of liberation's reading of this class.
That's
Of my
something that I need to read more about. Maybe I'll have a chance to do that in maybe a month or so.
Yeah,
I know none of the students know this, but I'm retiring in May. So this is it. This is like the last thing I'm going to do for the college, and I wanted to do it specifically for Sean because of all of the help he gave me when he was chair of the department and all of the things he did to help promote the Mexican American Studies program, Mexican American history courses. So this is my way of saying thanks, Sean.
Oh, well, and thank you, Gilbert. I really appreciate you taking the time to present this. I think it is an important discussion, especially in the way you framed it, that the mestizo is more of a sense of being open-minded and something that we are confronting, I think, right here in the United States in a serious crisis that is leading to, the loss of life for people caught in the literal crossfires of this conundrum.
Well, Latin America is still in the midst of this, to be honest. They're much further ahead of us in terms of dealing with the really complex interactions between, people who are essentially white supremacists, the Latin American version of it, right? And the mestizo population that is the majority of the rest of Latin America. So you're still seeing some very complex interactions between them, but they're much further along in terms of giving mestizos more of an opportunity, more of a chance at getting the kind of life that people who are not very clearly mestizo, people who have my complexion, for example, have. Just for whatever it's worth, I can tell you that I have been treated in my life a lot differently than my father, because my father was dark-skinned and I wasn't, or I'm not. So I've been treated much better than he ever was. And there are places that we have gone together, northeast New Mexico, where my father was treated like the Antichrist. And I was looked at like, what are you doing with this, inferior person? This is my dad, I would say, and we would walk out, right? So, Lord God knows. One other thing that I wanted to mention just really briefly about capitalism that I thought of, when we were talking about how it can operate. One thing that we need to notice is that a lot of people talk about the importance of freedom in this country. But I would like you to notice that in a capitalist system, there are three basic classes, right? Rich, middle class, and poor, right? Now, as we get closer and closer to today, it's easier for people who are poor to go into the ranks of the middle class. As a matter of fact, we have learned as a capitalist system that is constantly evolving that you want people in the middle class because they pay and they buy stuff. I mean, they pay taxes and they buy stuff, right? So you actually want the majority of your population in the middle class. But going from the middle class to the ranks of the rich, practically impossible. Going from poor to rich, much less so, right? So impossible, or practically impossible, that when somebody pulls it off, we know them by name. King LeBron, Michael Jackson, right? When people pull off this really impressive feat, we know who they are. Think about how many people you know by name in your life, and then ask yourself, how do you know them? Most of them are related. Most of them are friends. And then the others, who you may never have met, are the ones who have pulled off this really, really difficult trick of getting into the ranks of the wealthy. That's not a good thing to say about a system.
Uh, Maybe I can add, and I agree with the difficulty that is to move into the rich ranking. The thing that I was reading about recently is about the way that the US is no longer actually like a capitalist system. It has become more into a corporative system where the big corporations dominate and stuff like that, which is actually thanks to the increment of the state growing its power into the same amount of, for example, lobbying. These corporations are lobbying politicians, and these politicians are basically working for the corporations. This could be also how
This is a
capitalism
very
can be.
popular idea. Yeah, I'm familiar with that, and I know that this is a very widespread idea. I don't
Yeah,
agree with
yeah,
it, but I mean, I know that there are people making that argument.
yeah, yeah. And the thing is that by increasing this method of letting the corporations grow and stuff like that, it can actually hurt the society as a whole because, I mean, for example, 2008, when bigger corporations went into bankruptcy and many people lost their home, but the corporations that actually went to get back bankruptcy got saved by the government, which I totally disagree. I believe that corporations should fall for their own mistakes, like a
It's,
capitalist system should work.
capitalism has a Darwinistic element to it, and you're absolutely correct. If the businesses cannot evolve, if they cannot adapt to changing environmental conditions, then they should go out of business. You're right, 100%.
Yeah, that is the essential idea of it. Like recently, we actually noticed how corrupt even the market could be. Like, for example, I don't know if you guys saw the news about GameStop and stuff like that, that some rich Wall Street people are actually rigging the system because they were actually using the system to get richer, but even the individual, like a regular person, which I'm included because I participated on it, actually has no place to even compete with them because they apparently feel superior to the people, to the normal
It-
people that want to actually.
The
Yeah,
Have
house
you
always wins the bets.
have you
yeah,
ever seen a movie called The Big Short?
yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's a really bad scam, really bad.
Indeed.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, I was thinking about that when you were talking. The GameStop thing was fascinating. There are so many different levels to that. For anyone who doesn't know, I mean, and not that I can do it justice at all, but apparently some small investors on something called Robinhood decided that they wanted to try to make money against the system by betting that GameStop would start to become the biggest corporation on the planet, and that drove their stock price from like 2 cents a share to like $2 million a share or something like that. I mean, literally overnight. And people just made a lot of money off of it that way. And there was some thought that this was like the victory of the little guy against the big guy, but then there were other stories that came out and said maybe that wasn't the case. Maybe that there was something else much deeper at play. I don't feel qualified to discuss the rest of it. That's about as good as I can do.
yeah. But it's just a little example of how it is true that America has become something else. And I can actually disagree at saying like capitalism is the result of all this issue, which America has leave the actual definition of it, which is the free enterprise, free trade, and stuff like that. We actually can see that is no longer that way. And
Hmm.
yeah,
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hinojosa. I appreciate that.
thank
Yeah,
you
those are
for.
incredibly thoughtful comments. I think the thing that we need to keep in mind too is since this society has become highly complex from the Industrial Revolution, the one thing we need to keep in mind with capitalism is the concept of economic interdependence. And so if we're looking back at I think there's a lot of romance of capitalism looking back like at Adam Smith's the idea of the invisible hand. people, the market is controlled just through people's basic needs and what they can provide and what they need. But beginning in the late 1800s with the Industrial Revolution, what we began to see is that more and more aspects of the economy are completely out of our control, and it's no fault of anybody's own if they are laid off. This has to do with, and they lose their job, or a country goes to war, or supply chains are disrupted. How we can take care of ourselves and sustain ourselves is becoming more and more difficult to mediate for the individual. So yeah, always the concept of interdependence is something to keep in mind when it comes to using capitalism as a tool. One of the things that you pointed out of the corporation rising and lobbying the government class to make sure corporations' interests are served by the government reminds me of a quote of Karl Marx, who was very astute at the dynamics of capitalism, and he wrote that the executive, the government of the modern state, is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie, right? And so this was something that Marx saw in the late 1840s, that it would be very difficult to control the inner workings of capitalism, because they have the time, they have the power to supplant themselves into a governing system that at least had the pretense of saying that people are free to make their own decisions and their affairs in their pursuit of happiness. Jesus says, oh, they have a lot against them. It's just a process is very long. Indeed. I used to work with attorneys handling lawsuits against Robinhood, billing lawsuits. Unfortunately, I did not know more on the side of Robinhood scamming a lot of people. Yeah, that was an interesting turn of events there, Jesus. If any students had any questions for Mr. Reyes before we conclude the evening, this is your chance. You can get us in the chat or turn on your mic. Okay, if not, well, thank you guys very much for joining along. This is a very useful conversation that we had. I enjoyed these conversations always. For my students, again, I will have this, I'm recording it right now, and I'll have the video, the link available tomorrow. And as well as the reaction paper assignment, which will be in Blackboard or in the evening chats folder. Jesus writes, I really enjoyed tonight. Thank you for this. I am glad we met you before you retired. Oh, excellent. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. It was a really good talk.
Gracias.
Thanks to all of you. Gracias, Gilberto. Thanks, Sean.
All right.
Yes.
You guys take care. You guys have a good evening, and we'll talk to you later. Excellent. We're getting some great comments here. Glad everybody enjoyed it and appreciated it. Excellent.
Bye-bye. Y'all have a good night.
You too.